Excellent. Really quickly, Eric Beavers, thank you so much for the generous support, and Doug Schaefer also thank you for the support. They say no question, just happy to hear familiar voices from the space community. Love your coverage and all you do always. Thank you so much, everybody that supported the channel. About 30 seconds to go to launch of IXPE from 39A in Florida.
Indeed. So at this point, Falcon 9 is pressurized for flight. We've gotten the final go decision, and the next major event will be the ignition of the 9 Merlin 1D engines on the first stage of the Falcon 9. That ignition will come very shortly. So here we go. 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and lift off of the Falcon 9 with IXP revolutionizing X-ray astronomy. And some absolute epicness, hoping that sound came across our microphone beautifully. It
Oh, it
was
did.
chest pounding out here. Falcon 9 lifting off into humid conditions, epic sound, and flying straight and true due east out of Kennedy, taking XP on her way to orbit. So far, so good, Jack.
Yeah, that was excellent audio as usual. You can just hear the sound of those 9 Merlin engines just tearing the air asunder as they lift Falcon 9 into orbit. Great track
That
here
is
from
an
Thomas.
excellent way to put it. Yeah, an
It's just what
excellent
it
track.
sounds like, right? It sounds like the air is being physically torn apart. There's no other way I could describe it to the uninitiated. The sound of a rocket launch, especially when atmospheric conditions are just right, is truly indescribable. And you can see the exhaust plume expanding there as Falcon 9 ascends into lower pressure up at high altitude. It's just absolutely beautiful. Great work, Thomas.
Oh, it really is. And here we go, heading toward stage shutdown and separation here. We have shutdown of the first stage, and we are seeing the ignition of the second stage here. Yep, and we have good ignition on the second stage with the old Mark 1 eyeball.
Yep, and Thomas has got it with the camera still. Excellent work, buddy. Now, the first stage will prepare to head down and land on the drone ship, and the second stage will keep muscling XP into orbit.
Yes, indeed. That second stage really moving out here from what you can see on the ground. Really gaining a lot more of that horizontal acceleration. The first stage gives you the vertical acceleration to get out of the dense lower atmosphere. And then the second stage's job is really to just tip you over horizontal and just slam the accelerator on that because we are aiming for approximately 7.6 kilometers per second as our orbital velocity target for a 600-kilometer orbit. So lots of work that second stage has to do getting that horizontal acceleration down for this mission.
Yeah, that was pretty nifty. For a few moments there before we cut to the SpaceX stream, on Thomas's feed, we could see a couple stars in frame, and it really gave sort of a sense of scale to how fast that second stage was moving at that point. It's really cooking.
It really is. It really is. And
Coming up on Fairing Sep and Sep. Looks
woohoo!
like a
And
good
there's
one.
tiny little Ixby. look at tiny little XP.
Which is bigger, Dart or IXPE? I know Dart is heavier based on what we were talking about earlier, but physically, I wonder which is a smaller spacecraft.
Dart was smaller. So XP fully extended, once its boom is extended, will be 5.2 meters long, 1.1 meters in diameter for the physical like telescope itself, and then the solar arrays will have a diameter of 2.7 meters. So actually, this thing could have been completely unfolded inside the payload fairing of the Falcon 9 with a lot of room to spare. Um,
That's hilarious.
but it still needs to be all folded up and sort of like hunkered down for the stresses of liftoff, which is why there are still things to unfold and expand and deploy once we get into orbit.
That makes sense. And we are coming up on entry burn for the booster.
Woohoo!
We can see it for a brief moment there, a feed from the booster, and you can see sort of the limb of the Earth and the
And one,
lights of different cities at night. It was really beautiful. Thomas still tracking this thing on the
oh
left
yeah,
there. Way
and
to go.
it is clear off to the eastern horizon, so we should be able to see the entry burn happening from the launch site as well. That entry burn happening about 530 kilometers downrange from the launch site, and we should be able to see it crystal clear here
Fingers
momentarily.
crossed. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, the second stage is still that little dot, getting closer and closer to the horizon. Uh, but just
Just
standing
over
by.
5.5 minutes from liftoff.
And again, Falcon 9 taking the Imaging X-ray Polarimetry Explorer, the IXPE X-ray Astronomy Observatory, into low Earth orbit. The initial ascent here, we're on the second stage, so this initial ascent will result in a 600-kilometer orbit, plus or minus 15 kilometers is allowable per the mission. There's entry burn. We can see the entry burn from the launch site. Thomas looks like he's got it or is acquiring. He's got it on his camera. That is the
Nice.
entry burn of booster 1061-5 headed for just read the instructions. That burn is happening about 550 kilometers downrange from the launch site. And we are seeing it crystal clear, and it is done. So the booster headed for the drone ship there.
That was
And
cool.
now
There's a very, very barely illuminated bird sitting on one of the pilings in that shot. What a cool shot.
that would
And
be
just
our resident unimpressed pelican.
nice.
Yes.
Just goes to show, I mean, how big Falcon 9 is, that despite being, what did you say, 500 kilometers downrange, we could still see it on a clear night like that.
Yep.
And so that entry burn shielded the booster from the heat of re-entry. So now it gets to coast a little bit longer, and at the same time as it's landing, roughly, the second stage engine will shut off for the first time. Right, Chris?
Yeah, so normally, yes. On this one, a little bit different. The Falcon 9 will be in orbit less than 50 seconds from now. So we will actually complete the ascent to orbit on the second stage before before the landing burn begins on the first stage for this particular one, because IXPE is so light of a payload.
Nice.
Falcon 9 can get into its initial orbit much quicker. And speaking of which, with about 30 seconds of powered flight remaining, so the initial orbit is 600 kilometers plus or minus 15 kilometers is allowable at 28.5 degrees inclination. We will then have a roughly 20-minute coast. It's like 20 minutes, 47 seconds. Down to the equator, as just the orbital trajectory takes you down to the equator off of Africa. And that's when we will then have the reignition of the second stage, not to change the orbital apogee or perigee, but to change the inclination only from 28.5 degrees down to 0. And we see the shut-off and shutdown of the Merlin vac engine there. And we see the landing burn starting. Look at that.
Whole lot of pixels coming through on SpaceX's feed. Let's see if they keep drone chip signal. So
Ooh.
far, so good.
I see a flame.
I see pixels.
I see flame out.
And it
I
landed.
see a booster. Yeah. So that is 1060. That is 1061-6. Now sitting on the drone ship, the boosters level up upon landing. So that is now 1061-6, sitting on just to read the instructions, and it'll be brought back for another mission now. Um, and meanwhile, a new shot of the second stage engine as we are in our approximately 20-minute coast across the Atlantic now.
Very cool. I always love those nighttime drone ship landings where you see the ocean lit up blue by Falcon's exhaust. But what I love even more is this view that we have right here, which is what we always want to see on launch day, which is a launch pad without a rocket because the rocket has done its job and flown.
Precisamundo. Yes.
Very cool stuff. And there is the spacecraft very briefly on top of the second stage. There's a second stage engine. You said 20-minute coast phase?
Yep, just over 20 minutes to coast down to the proper point in the orbit where they will do the burn. Not quite exactly over the equator. You kind of time it so that you've finished changing your inclination when you reach zero. So, or in this case, 0.2 degrees, which is what they're aiming for. And there is and as well as the plus or minus 15 kilometers that's allowable in the orbit for where Falcon 9 will drop IXPE off in, they are also allowed to be within 0.2 degrees inclination of the target. So they could wind up at either true 0 or 0.4. And that would be fine for the mission in terms of meeting the parameters for the liftoff.